Good morning. Pastor has asked me to come on about once a week for about 5 or 10 minutes and just share a quick devotional of something I've been learning or something that might be an encouragement to those of you out there during this time of separation from each other. And so this will be the first iteration. I'll just come on, give a brief devotional, and you can take it or leave it for what it's worth. As every good presentation and presenter knows, you got to have a good backdrop. So I went out into rural Muscatine. I found this beautiful barn behind me. I'm going to stand in front of this, and that'll add some aesthetic to the presentation here. I was recently forced to do some homework for school that had me studying the end times, and specifically, my studies brought me to the eternal state, the New Jerusalem, the new earth where God will dwell with his people for eternity. And while I was doing historical background and context studies and word studies, what I found was remarkably encouraging. And so much so that I went ahead and used what I found as a family devotion a couple weeks ago. And then I posted a boiled down version on Snapface a couple days ago, so everybody on the World Wide Web could see that as well. But in particular, Revelation 21 and verses 1 through 7, I found very encouraging. And Revelation 21, 1 through 7 reads, "When I saw the new heaven," speaking of John here, "when I saw the new heaven and the new earth, the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man, and he will dwell with them. And they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. And he will wipe every tear away from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away.' And he who was seated on the throne said, 'Behold, I am making all things new.' Also he said, 'Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.' And he said to me, 'It is done. It is finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the springs of the water of life without payment. This is free. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son.'" My focus was on the phrase in verse 3, "He will dwell with them." And as we explore the theme of salvation from Genesis all the way through Revelation, we find that God strongly desires to restore a broken relationship with humanity that was shattered in Eden's garden at the beginning of time. We see glimpses of God in his covenant with Abraham, wanting to have a people who would be restored and brought to him and dwell with him in perfect fellowship. In Exodus 26 and 27, God gives Moses the plan for the tabernacle, the tent of meeting where God would reside among his people in a localized and visible form. And for an invisible and omnipresent God to decide to become localized and, in a sense, visible for his people, that's probably something worth paying attention to. That is significant. And once the tabernacle was completed and instituted, a visible manifestation of God's presence would descend upon that tabernacle, and God would dwell among his people in that way. Some 12 to 1300 years later, again, we see God descend to humanity in the form of God the Son. God's presence once again descended. That descending is very significant, and we're going to see that several times this morning. God the Son descended among man for about 33 years. And John 1:14 says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory." And this verb for the Son of God dwelling among humanity is the same word concept that we see in the Old Testament of God dwelling with his people. It has the same connotation of tabernacling or pitching his tent. He was there to stay, at least for a time. And he would dwell, metaphorically, he would tent among humanity leading up to his final sacrifice on the cross. And centuries later, almost 2 millennia later, we still await the events that we see unfolding in Revelation that finally culminate in God's everlasting dwelling with man and among men forever. We long for the day when Revelation 21:3 is no longer in the future tense, but is in the present tense, that the dwelling place of God is with man, that he dwells with them, and they are his people, and God himself is with them as their God. The rest of Revelation 21 is a description of the New Jerusalem that descends from heaven onto the earth, where God will reside with his creation for all eternity. But this is not the first time in the Bible that we see a description of this city. In fact, if you go back to your favorite Old Testament book, the one that you probably study all the time, Ezekiel, we find towards the end of the book that Ezekiel is laid out that the dimensions of the city, how it is composed, different gates, different walls, what this city, New Jerusalem, is going to look like. At the very end of that chapter, the very last verse of chapter 48, really the last verse of the entire book, this is what we read. The name of that city will be, "The Lord is there." All right, we're not going to call the New Jerusalem, as John calls it, the holy city, the city of Zion, Jerusalem, none of that. When that city comes down and God dwells there, the name of that place will be called, "The Lord is there." Two Hebrew words, Yahweh Shema, Yahweh being Jehovah, Shema being is there. Jehovah Shema, the Lord is there. Do you think that if God desires to dwell with his people, really from 6,000 years ago or so all the way until now, that and into the future, that even right now he would desire to dwell with his people? And I would give a very confident yes. That is the case. God desires to dwell with his people. In fact, in James 4 we read, "For those who draw near to God in humility, he desires to draw near to them." All right, God desires to dwell with us. Don't become sidetracked with all the temporal. All right, all this will pass, and God is greater than this. Take these truths about God, that God desires to be with us, that God is there, and encourage yourself with these truths today, and we will see you soon.